Hey guys, so today's lesson is about energy in the biosphere. So we're essentially going to be talking about how energy moves through plants and animals in an ecosystem. So for this lesson on energy in the biosphere, we're going to be going over what the primary source of energy in the biosphere is. Then we're going to go over what different trophic levels are and define things like autotrophs and heterotrophs. And then lastly, we're going to look at how to interpret food chains and food webs. It also says that you can draw them. You won't have to draw any food webs, though. The most complicated thing you will have to draw is a food chain. So the biosphere, as we talked about in the last lesson, is made up of different ecosystems, and every ecosystem structure is based on how energy flows through that ecosystem and different cycles of matter, which we're going to be looking at later in this unit. Matter is everything that takes up space and has a mass, and energy is the capacity to do work. The primary source of energy for the entire Earth is the sun. Solar radiation, which is the energy that comes from the sun, is made up of a whole bunch of different types of electromagnetic radiation. Some of the high energy waves, which are the ones that have short wavelengths and high frequency, are really harmful to living things. Though luckily, a lot of those waves are filtered out by the upper atmosphere and the ozone layer. So that includes things like X-rays and UV radiation. The medium energy waves are the ones that include the visible light. So what we think of when we talk about sunlight, and that's what's used for photosynthesis in plants. And then there's also some lawn energy waves, which have long wavelengths and are low frequency. Those low energy waves are not harmful. They include things like infrared radiation, which we see as heat. Okay, so trophic levels is something that you're probably familiar with from elementary school. This is how we organize the flow of energy through an ecosystem. Trophic levels are categories of living things based on how those organisms gain their energy. The two kind of main categories of trophic level are the autotrophs, which are always in the first trophic level, and then the heterotrophs, which are all of the other trophic levels. An autotroph is any organism that produces its own food, and there's two different methods of doing this. The first is the photoautotrophs, which essentially use sunlight and nutrients out of the soil in order to get their energy. And then the second is chemoautotrophs, which use non-organic energy sources. Autotrophs, both photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs, are sometimes just called producers because they produce their own energy. It includes things like plants, algae, and some bacteria. Photosynthesis, as we said, is the method used by photoautotrophs to produce food. This includes all of our different plant species that take in energy from sunlight, carbon dioxide from the air, and water from the ground in order to produce glucose. And then they store that glucose to be used later on as an energy source. And that's how most of the energy that exists in our ecosystem gets converted from abiotic components to biotic components. So it gets converted essentially from solar energy or sunlight into the glucose stored in plants. Chemosynthesis is the method that's used by the chemoautotrophs. This is when carbon dioxide, water, and a different energy source other than sunlight are used to make nutrients. One of the more common methods of this is to use chemical energy from inorganic substances like hydrogen sulfide or ammonia. That chemical energy can essentially be used to convert different molecules into glucose, just like solar energy can be used to do that in plants. Thermal energy can also be used to convert molecules into more complex organic molecules like glucose. chemosynthesis tends to occur in caves or really deep in oceans where there's little to no sunlight. So you will not find chemosynthesis or chemoautotrophs in sunny places. Many bacteria, however, that live in really deep oceans and stuff like that are chemoautotrophs. And then our heterotrophs, as we said, are the organisms that make up all of the other trophic levels. They are also called consumers because they get their energy by consuming other organisms. Heterotrophs cannot make their own energy. But there are a bunch of different types of heterotrophs. The first is the primary consumers. So primary consumers are the heterotrophs that eat autotrophs in order to gain energy. They always make up the second trophic level, the first trophic level being the producers or the autotrophs. They're usually herbivores, though not always. Some of them can survive on chemoautotrophic bacteria, which would make them either an omnivore or a carnivore. Then we have the secondary consumers, the tertiary consumers, the quaternary consumers, etc. They make up the third, fourth, and fifth trophic levels, and they can be carnivores or omnivores. So yeah, the secondary consumers, for instance, eat the primary consumers, and then the tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers, and the quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers. They always eat the level directly below them. With that being said, an organism can exist in more than one of these levels at a time. So for example, you might have an organism that eats both the secondary consumer and plants. It's like an omnivore, so it's eating plants and animals. Something like that would be both a primary consumer and a tertiary consumer at the same time. So you can have an organism exist in multiple trophic levels simultaneously. The other thing to watch out for is the fact that the numbers of the trophic levels do not match with the name of the consumer. So the secondary consumer is the third trophic level, and the tertiary consumer is the fourth trophic level. So the number of the trophic level is one above the number of the consumer, and the reason for that is because the first trophic level is taken up by something that's not a consumer. It's taken up by the autotrophs. Then we also have decomposers, which are sometimes a distinct trophic level and are sometimes just ignored. They do play a very unique but important role in energy transfer in ecosystems. Essentially, decomposers always get their energy from eating or breaking down dead things or waste products from living things like feces and stuff. Decomposers will feed on every other trophic level. As long as the thing is dead, decomposers will feed on it. So a food chain is how we show a linear sequence of who is eating who in an ecosystem. And they're very simplified ways of showing the flow of energy. So in this example here, we have our autotroph or our producer, which is in the first trophic level. We go up to the second trophic level, which is our primary consumer, the grasshopper, up to the third trophic level, which is our secondary consumer, the frog, and then our fourth trophic level, which is the tertiary consumer, the python. So we always start with our autotrophs being the first trophic level, and then every time something gets eaten and we move up to the thing that ate it, we're moving up a trophic level. So you can just count the trophic levels 1, 2, 3, 4. Very straightforward. Yeah, so that's really all this is talking about. These are just two different examples. On this side, we have, again, first trophic level, second, third, fourth, fifth trophic level. Again, pay attention to the fact that the fifth trophic level is the quaternary consumer, and the fourth is the tertiary, and the third is the secondary, and the second is the primary. Okay. Food webs are much more realistic ways of showing how energy is transferred through an ecosystem and who is being predated on by who. They show how all the different food chains that exist in an ecosystem are actually connected to one another, and how an organism can have more than one food source or more than one predator. And sometimes this will also show decomposers, which we don't usually see in food chains. So you won't always see them in food webs either. Ecosystems that have more biodiversity, which is again more species, tend to have more complex food webs. And so, as we talked about in the last lesson, more biodiversity means more stability for your ecosystem. And one of the reasons for that is if you have a really complex food web, because you have really high biodiversity, if one species has a bad year and its population drops off, it's less likely to impact the entire rest of the ecosystem. And that's because if that one food source starts declining, if you have high biodiversity and a really complex food web, it's likely that that organism's predators have another food source that they can switch over to and start relying on more heavily. So those really complex food webs make an ecosystem more stable. If you have a really simple food web, as soon as one organism's population starts to go down, its predator is probably also going to start dying off because of starvation, and whatever eats that predator is going to start going down, and you can have this kind of domino effect of all of your populations in that ecosystem slowly dying off and starving just because one organism was having a bad year or something. So this is an example of what a food web would look like. I would like you to pause here and take a moment to go through, label your producers for each of your consumers, say if they are primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary. You can also have a consumer that is above the level of quaternary, so a 5th level consumer and a 6th level consumer, and that's all that we call them. They don't have special names. And then also, while you're at it, name the trophic levels. So 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, etc. trophic level. This will be really important because on tests and quizzes and stuff like that, I might just say, name all of the tertiary consumers. Or I could say, name all of the organisms in the 5th trophic level. And so you do need to be able to kind of go through and label all of the different things in a food web like this. So try it and then come back and we will take it up. Okay, so let's go through what this would look like. I recommend always starting with your producers. So find your producers and then go from there. So I'm going to start with the phytoplankton down here, and I'm going to name the trophic levels first. Doesn't matter if you start with the trophic levels or like the different types of producers and consumers. I just find the trophic levels easier. So this would be trophic level 1 because it's a producer, and then we're just going to follow the arrows, and you can start in either direction. You can start going to the zooplankton or to the krill. I'm just going to go to the zooplankton first. So that makes that level 2. Follow the arrow to the fish. That's level 3. To the seagull is 4. Over to the, oh, that's an ugly 4. Whoa, okay. Over to the leopard seal, which would be 5. Over to the killer whale, which would be 6. Okay, so I just followed the arrows until I got to the killer whale, and nothing eats the killer whale. I could have here also start at the phytoplankton, which is 1, go to the zooplankton, which is 2, go to the fish, which is 3. But from here, instead of going to the seagull, I could go directly to the leopard seal, which makes the leopard seal a 4 in that case, and the killer whale would be a 5 in that case. Then I could also start at the phytoplankton and go to the krill, which would make the krill number 2. And then from the krill, I could go to the fish, which would be 3, and then 4, 5, 6, 4, 3, 4, 5. But since the fish is 3 in both of those, or in all of those, everything from there on would be the same. From the krill, I could also go up to the blue whale, which means the blue whale is in the 3rd trophic level, and then nothing else. I could also start over on the seaweed here. Seaweed is a producer, so it would be number 1. The crab would be trophic level 2. The squid would be 3. The elephant seal would be 4, and the killer whale would be 5. Or from the squid here, I could have also gone to the penguin, which would make the penguin 4, and then the killer whale 5. Or from the penguin, which is 4, I could have also gone over to the leopard seal, which is 5, and then the killer whale, which is 6. So essentially, you have to follow all of the possible different pathways of arrows in order to label all of these. And as you can see, many of these only exist in one trophic level, but there are some of them, like the leopard seal and the killer whale, that are existing in 2 different trophic levels at once, because they eat things that are in both the, we're looking at the killer whale here, they eat things that are in both the 4th and the 5th trophic level. And then I would just use these trophic levels to name them as producers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, etc. So anything that has a number 1 beside it is a primary consumer. Actually, I think I'm going to write this out for you guys. Okay, so we have our trophic levels on one side here, and then the type of producer or consumer on the other side. So whenever you have a number 1 for your trophic level, it is an autotroph. Again, it could be a photoautotroph or a chemoautotroph. Those are also called producers. Anything in the 2nd trophic level is a primary consumer. 3rd trophic level is a secondary consumer. 4th trophic level is a tertiary consumer. 5th trophic level is the quaternary consumer. That's as high as we go in specific names for consumers. So anything that's in the 6th trophic level, we just call a 5th level consumer. Okay? Again, the level of consumer is 1 less than the trophic level. Okay, that is it for today's lesson. Let me know if you have any questions.